afterwards if you want a copy. So I'll try to mention this a few weeks until we get these handed out. And we do, like I said, we do have one was saved for the church library, so we can have that. I want to mention a couple things before kind of open up the mic. Let me just first confess that with this sermon series, I might have bitten off more than I could chew. Probably each of these sermons really should be about 45-minute lectures, not 20-minute sermons. So I have a lot of information that wasn't a sermon earlier in the week that now had to go. So I've got some of that information here. So a couple of things I want to mention, first of all, is one of the things that oftentimes dominates this story in the gospel is this idea that's mentioned several times in the gospel that Jesus came to the Jewish people first and then the Gentiles secondary. So if we were not Jewish, Jesus didn't come for us directly. So there's this idea in the Gospels which is not well defined, and so oftentimes in this story that kind of dominates the discussion, which I got to tell you I found very boring and don't think it really helps us for how we live our lives today. So the couple times I preached on this passage, including today, I just kind of leave that basically by the side. It is a little bit at the end of the sermon. Willie Jennings talks about that and talks about it in the way that Christians often misread this story because we do it from the perspective that we're the host and the woman's the outsider. But if you go literally by the story, and in Matthean theology, today's Christians, which are 99% Gentile, are the outsiders. And so that at least that vantage point, I think, has some help to understand the story. So that's the first thing I wanted to mention that I left out of the sermon. The second thing is really how Matthew changes this story. I talk about this a lot in my book, Practicing Midrash, about when biblical authors take a story that's written earlier and they change it, and what's going on in their theology. So I think it's significant in a couple things. One is that Matthew left out the detail in Mark that Jesus goes to this house in Tyre and didn't want anybody to know he was there. It's like he's been traveling. It's like he needed a break, and so let's not be there. Now, oftentimes people think this is a part of the Messianic secret, which I think, Tammy, you mentioned that to me last week at the end, right? What does this Messianic secret mean? And I got to say, I've never been satisfied with how at least 20th century theologians dealt with that question. I know some of you who also are good biblical students and scholars may have a different take on that. But it's never been helpful for me, and most of those questions are kind of died out now. Matthew changes the story a little bit, and the biggest change for me is that he does not call her a Syrophoenician woman, as Mark does. He calls her a Canaanite. Well, at this time, there weren't any Canaanites. It was a pejorative term about peoples who basically had lost their identity by the time Jesus is around. And so this would kind of be a racial slur that you kind of could say. So from that point of view, Matthew kind of was already putting this woman on this kind of on the bad list. So in Mark's gospel, she is just a woman from another culture. The Phoenician people, as I mentioned in the sermon, were sea people. They were all over the Mediterranean Sea. They're probably seen as Greeks, Hellenists. So that's a very different perspective from Matthew, who wants to say that she's a bad person because she's linked to these bad people. So at that point, the story becomes this us versus them picture. Matthew also, in Mark's gospel, it kind of leads into the Jesus came for Jews first, Gentiles second. In Matthew, he changes that completely and just says Jesus came only for Israel. Which then the woman seems to open up a new avenue, because she says, well, Lord, even the dogs eat the crumbs from the table. And Jesus' response, You have such great faith. Which is interesting, in Matthew's gospel, there are two stories in which Jesus commends people who are having such great faith. It's this woman and a Canaanite, I'm not Canaanite, sorry, a centurion soldier from Rome, both of them being Gentiles. So I don't want to make too much of that, but that is an interesting piece in Matthew's gospel. So those are two pieces, the way that Matthew changed Mark's story, and this issue of, did Jesus come for Jews first or only Jews and then for Gentiles, neither of which I wanted to spend much time in the sermon on. A couple of things I want to say before we kind of open up for questions. This issue about inclusion in the 21st century liberal church is about sharing power and sharing leadership and helping people that you welcome into the church become integrated into the church body. And whenever that happens, that's an issue of sharing power, and sharing power is never easy for anybody, right? I mean, look, every time a child marries someone and there's a new in-law in the family, there's also a little bit of that there, right? Right? How does this new daughter-in-law, this new son-in-law, these mother-in-law, these mother-in-law, how do they change things? Because you got to share your experiences, right? So this is a basic thing to human nature. And it becomes bigger in institutions like churches. There's a common saying, a common reality that new ministers typically come and stay in a church around year 5 to 7. There's a key moment. And the key moment is either the church is bought into the new minister and it's going to be a long-term relationship, or they begin having ruffling of feathers and that new minister who's been here 5 to 7 years is soon not here anymore. And the piece behind that is, oftentimes if a minister stays in a church that long, 5, 6, 7 years, by that point there's a lot of newer people in the church. And these newer people have some different ideas, maybe the ideas of the new minister, which may not be all the ideas of the older members. And there you have a tension. Now, when I became pastor at Sardis Baptist, because it was a new church start, a small congregation, when I came there, within 3 years we had doubled our size. So my tension moment came a lot earlier than 7 years. By about year three and a half, we had a big tension point because we had all these new people that were now on all our leadership boards. And they didn't see the same things that the older people who had started the church had saw. And the older people were saying, we started this church. And the new people said, well, we're here now. And the pastor, oftentimes is the crunch point of that. And so during that year, we lost about 3 really important families. They just said, well, I'm taking my ball and go home. So this reality of sharing power is a hard thing. Our 20th century movement of becoming a welcoming church and saying the Christian church, particularly white churches, need to open their doors to all people, blacks, women in leadership, people of all color, gays and lesbians, because Jesus Christ is for everyone. God loves everyone as they are. And we jumped into that late 20th century, right? We jumped into that. And it was hard at first, but welcoming is relatively easy. Integrating is hard work. And that's where the difficult piece is. And so that's liberal congregations over the next 25, 50 years are going to be living into that difficult piece of really integrating those folks you're welcoming and making the church a multicultural experience in some way, right? Because we are more and more and more living in a multicultural world. And it's going to be harder and harder for churches really to be of one culture or a couple of cultures. So, this stuff's hard. Even Jesus had problems with it, right? Pops off this woman. The dogs don't deserve the children's food. Somehow she's not offended. Maybe she held her tongue for her daughter's sake. Who knows? And Jesus, upon listening, rather than talking, listening, hears something else and appreciates her faith and heals her daughter. Which I think, in short, is about how to do inclusion in the 21st century. All right, who's got some questions? So Dale, come on up. Come on, Victoria, and then Dale, you'll be second.
I'm Victoria Yagoyan, and I had the pleasure of going to a conference, Open and Relational Theology, and one of the participants was a neurologist. And she said that neurology plays a big role in all of our lives, including the biblical characters. She said that in this story, Jesus was tired. He had been very active, and then he was in a strange place, and he was unable to hear her as other than just a demand. And she said that the woman is patient with him, and that patience came from her neurological situation, and he finally got it. Jesus finally got it and then offered healing.
Yeah, I love that. I love that, Victoria. And I tried to allude to that at the beginning, but I did not know that story, and that's great. And, one reason she was in a neurologically good position, because she's living at the beach, right? I mean, so she's relaxed. But I do think that a part of that story is real in that Jesus goes away and did not want anyone to know he was there, and then this interruption happens. And when those things happen, sometimes we're not our best selves. Dale?
Tim, I appreciate you doing the historical overview as to the church's struggles with race and gender issues, and obviously there was a gospel they had not yet heard at that point, which raised the question in my mind as I was listening to you, what is the gospel we have not yet heard? Who is it that we are not seeing, we're not open to? My first thought was lawyers, but then I thought, I just said that for Ed, but who is it that the Myers Park Covenant Church needs to open our eyes to see that we have not yet seen?
Yeah, I'd love to see if anybody got an answer for Dale. I'm not going to try to answer that question. Who do you think we're not seeing? Anybody got a...
Obviously he's poking at me. This week, somebody came around and put one of those door hangers on my door. And Roy Cooper I've known for a very long time, and he's a very decent, good man. And it had a kind of an ugly, sinister-looking picture of Roy, and it said that Roy Cooper does not believe that children who have been the victims of an attempted abortion who are born alive should not get any medical care. That was, and it was a horrific-looking door hanger thing that was saying that Roy didn't want these children to get any relief. And there are churches all over this town, this community, that are really fired up about abortion. Now let's suppose that somebody comes to this church and says, you people have been misguided for a long time about this issue, and I'm on fire from the Lord about this because life is precious and it's from the Lord. And they decide they've got a whole family full of people that are going to get us straightened out. And they come in here and they say, we want to start a initiative and an outreach like we have at the Catholic Church over on South Boulevard, on Park Road. we'll start putting some crosses up in front of the church for all the babies that have been aborted. And y'all welcome us, you affirm us, everybody's welcome here, right? And we're going to tell people we're from Myers Park Covenant Church now, and everybody's welcome, but we, as people who are very concerned about this issue, really want to make this our mission. And we know that you will welcome us and affirm us. Now, what do we do about that? How do we handle that?
Yeah, and that, Ed, I think that's a great point. Theological or ideological differences are some of the toughest thing to be inclusive about these days. And, we went through this at Sardis at one time. We had a young couple. The wife had grown up in the Covenant Reformed tradition, so a more conservative background, but had become more open-minded and did not want to stay in her tradition and heritage. And so she and her husband found our congregation, became very active. She was a deacon pretty early. And one year had asked, could we as a congregation join the Walk for Life that was in town? We did the hunger walks, was another walk we did, and about that. And so we really struggled with that as a congregation because 3/4 of the congregation were like, no, we're not doing that, right on your topic. And so we ended up not doing that, but then had to evaluate, when we're doing other walks, are we leaving people out with their ideas and their theologies and ideologies? And we didn't have a good answer to that. They didn't get offended by it, thankfully, like the Syrophoenician woman, and stuck with us until she took a new job in Wisconsin a few years later. That is just a difficult piece. And one of the things I think we can do, which we tried at Sardis a lot of times, and I think this congregation does, is to make sure that we really respect everybody and their theology and their opinion. We can say as a congregation, we have joined this tradition. This is our general theology for a congregation. But as individual people, we truly believe in soul freedom. We just said that in worship. And if we really truly believe in soul freedom, then somehow we got to respect people who have different ideas and different theologies. But that cuts both ways. You can't have somebody coming in and interrupting the sermon, or taking over a Sunday school class, a faith formation class, because they don't think their idea is being heard. Give them a chance to share their idea, their theology, in a respectful way, but also allow others in the congregation to share theirs. And again, this is a tough thing. This idea of inclusion sounds really good. We all want everybody to come together and have kumbaya, right? But living it out is difficult. I think you've named one group. I will say another group for Dale. So go ahead, Tammy, and then Carol. And then Carla.
Okay. You gave us a lot to chew on this morning. Thank you. And in one way, I think the Canaanite woman was the ultimate mother. That's the ultimate mother story, because she was willing to be insulted, but still stand there because she wanted her daughter to be healed. And then Jesus was the ultimate white male privilege. I mean, he was so white male arrogant. But, in chewing on this, I'm thinking there are some subtle underneath elements to this. One